Hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here on a wet night. It's much better to be in here than out there. As was introduced, my name is Octavia Bright. I'm delighted to be here with Lyndsey, Professor Lyndsey Stonebridge, for this event, which is called The Books That Made Me. So we're going to talk about Lyndsey's work, but we're also going to talk about Lyndsey's reading habits and the books that have kind of contributed to the way she sees things, the themes that she's been interested in throughout her career, and then eventually we're going to get on to talking about her new book, which is fascinating. But I think let's start with a kind of a soft in, basically, because I know one of the things that the program is hoping to achieve with these talks is to show people all of the different ways that professors and academics in the humanities find their way into their subjects. And I know a lot of the time when we're making choices when we're younger, we're not necessarily doing it very consciously. And I think sometimes the question of how did you get where you are today can be a very difficult one to answer. But I wonder if you can see a through line from your kind of younger self to where you've ended up and the things that you're interested in writing about now.
Thank you, Octavia, and thank you for coming. I didn't think anyone was going to come. It's a wretched night, so I'm incredibly grateful. And I was saying, as we started, I think there'll just be about 5 people. We can go to the bar and we'll talk about the books. And I hope we can do that too. No, I'm very grateful. Thank you. It's a good question. I remember when I got my first job, someone said to me, "Which college did you go to?" And I said, "North London Poly." And they said, "I had you down as a Girton girl." I'd passed. I left home very early, and I was an autodidact. I read and I read and I read. And I did go to North London Poly in my early 20s, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now a luxury housing place on the corner of the Kentish Town Road. But in the 80s and 90s was a kind of hotbed of radical thought and thinking and activism. So I came in as an outsider, and I couldn't settle on what I wanted to do. So I did philosophy and I did literature, and then I did critical theory, and then I did a bit of history. So I think I always came to academia with questions, with a kind of unsettled, and because I was curious. And then at that time, academia was a place where you could do that. And also because it was, after a while, I got a job and I got a PhD, and it was very nice. It's a very nice job for a long time. It's a very privileged job. So I stayed. So I do see my young self in what I became, whatever that is, insofar as I'm slightly from the outside, not radically from the outside, but slightly from the outside, which means I can be quite chippy. And it also means I always used to do the work, because you think that all of them are doing the work. That's why they're really clever. It took me ages to realize that they were bullshitting. And all these boys who told me they'd read Hegel hadn't really read Hegel. So yes, I do see that. And that kind of restlessness as well.
I mean, Hannah Arendt is a massive figure in your work, and she was also an outsider, wasn't she? So that feels like quite an interesting thread. When did you first encounter her writing?
I encountered her writing as a graduate student in the late 80s and early 90s. And no one was reading her then at all, partly because she wasn't a feminist, and I was working on feminism and psychoanalysis. Partly because she was considered difficult, and she wasn't left-wing enough, but she wasn't philosophical enough. She fell between the boundaries. And I picked up The Human Condition, which is her second big book, and thought, I've never read anything like this before in my life. I don't know where this woman's coming from. And at the time, we were all deconstructing everything, so that we had to sit through these seminars with Lacan, not with Lacan, thank goodness, but on Lacan. And we were told very profoundly, la femme n'existe pas, the woman does not exist. And I listened to Hannah Arendt, I thought, well, this one does. Because her voice was so strong and seemed to come from nowhere. But she's also a good writer, so she was witty and funny and accurate. So I read her quietly.
And then she stayed with you?
Then she stayed with me.
Yeah, we were talking before about how when I was doing my PhD, Hannah Arendt was very much out of fashion. and I came across her work. The way that you do, but I didn't really follow through with it. And I read Simone Weil instead, who was kind of a counterpart. But coming to her now, it feels like she's speaking about now, and with a voice from now. Her voice sounds incredibly contemporary. Do you find that?
Yes, and well, two responses to that. I think she would have hated this, but in some ways, social media helped Hannah Arendt because she writes beautiful aphorisms. She loved Nietzsche, and Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms, so she would write very crisp aphorisms and then be a whole paragraph afterwards where you had to really work hard. And so that was great for Twitter. And also, people didn't know how beautiful she was or how photogenic. So my copy of The Human Condition has her with a not very good haircut, looking quite cross. And so suddenly, when Trump came and authoritarianism returned, the internet was flooded with Arendt, and she became fashionable. Yes, her voice does sound very contemporary, and the things she's concerned about are very contemporary. But on the other hand, she would always say, she says several times, we can't deal with analogies. Each time has a bit that something's unprecedented. You need to work it out. And she says comprehension is about facing up to what the reality is so you can resist that reality. So she was kind of very anti-theoretical in that way. She believed in experience. And remember, she experienced totalitarianism. She was a refugee. She was, she kept her life, but she knew what it was like to be a victim of anti-Semitism firsthand. She was in a camp. So the kind of, how do we understand this? How can we comprehend this? Has to be made anew each time.
Yeah, which is quite a tall order for many people who are just trying to get through the day, right? Like, I think one of the reasons that her thought maybe fell out of fashion a little bit was that it's demanding. It's very demanding. We're going to come back to her, but I want to now turn the lens on you and really start thinking about the books that have contributed to your thinking. And so the first question is actually going all the way back to childhood. Was there a particular book from your childhood or your young adulthood that had a really profound effect on you?
I got very cross with the team at the British Academy because they said, what are the books that made you? And I thought, oh, that's great. What a great topic. And they said, you can only have 10. And I thought, oh. I'm an academic. I have a lot of books that are very important to me. And then I came to the meeting with 10. They said, you can have 5. And I actually lost my temper. Holly will remember. It's like, what? But it's it's a really good way to think about a life. And I think the stories of what you read early always say something about class or history and the times you grew up in. And my story is not unusual, a story about class. So all my parents, I say all my parents because my parents were in the 60s and 70s and they're very promiscuous, so there's quite a lot of them dotted around the place, were working class, made good grammar school people. And my mother, who was a very clever woman, had got into Birmingham to do English literature and art, which was great. And then she had 3 accidents. Her boyfriend she was in a car accident with her boyfriend. He was very badly hurt. So that meant she failed her A-levels. She went to teaching training college up in Leeds. That's what you did. And her best friend died in another car accident. And the 3rd accident was me. And she was a reader. And she did a lot to coax me into reading. So she gave me the books she thought was important. Yeah, she gave me Anne Frank. She gave me Salinger. She gave me To Kill a Mockingbird. And then she just backed off and left me to read her books. And there's only one time when she didn't back off. And I read everything. Everything that she read, I read. And the only time she did intervene, I was reading Lawrence. And I got caught reading Lawrence at school. And it got confiscated. I can't remember what D.H. Lawrence. And my mother was furious. So she went up to the school to get the book back, and she gave me an A. Nin, Delta of Venus, which is pretty hardcore. So if you want to read about sex, you're going to read about this. So we never speak about this, but there's this relationship between learning, or being an autodidact, and how you discover your imagination and how you discover your world. And class, and of course race, and of course gender. And I still think that books are a gateway to that, not because they're a gateway to getting things, but because they're a gateway to imagining worlds you can be in the world.
Yeah, and also if you happen to grow up in a household without books or one that doesn't support reading, when children or young people find books that can open those doors for them outside of the home, it's also a very profound effect, isn't it?
Mm.
And I think that kind of journey you go on as a reader, where you read what's in front of you or what's been offered to you, and if you're lucky, that's lots of things, and if you're unlucky, that's not very much. And then you find your own path through it, and you find your own thread, and what you enjoy and what you don't like, and all of that. It's very exciting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the book that I chose for my early adulthood was Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, because I kind of wanted to emphasize that if you're a post-war kid, we were taught a lot of literature, and we were taught a lot of literature because there was an educational ideology that said if you want people not to be totalitarians, teach them lots of books, because it teaches them about perspective, it teaches them about argument. So we were taught an awful lot of Orwell, and I can remember reading A Hanging, which is a description of Orwell describing a hanging which actually took place in what was then Burma, so it was a colonial hanging. And it was just brilliant, his mastery of point of view, of perspective. But the thing I've always loved about Orwell is that he writes from a place which said, this is the world, and it could be otherwise. And so there's a sort of, he says at some point, as long as I live, I shall love the earth, the little things, and I shall always love good prose. I can't remember where he says that. And so when I read Down and Out in Paris and London, and I was very young, I was struck by its portrait of Paris. Paris was the migrant capital of the world in the late 20s, of the world in the late 20s. Paris and Constantinople, as was. So there's a migrant story there. There's a story about poverty. There's a story about precarity. But there's also this kind of determination to narrate. And then the second half of the book is on homelessness. And it always struck me as like, this is a person who is using literature to not only reimagine the world, but to say how the world is. And I feel quite strongly, because Orwell got kind of taken up by boys and by the right as a certain version of Englishness. But Orwell was fiercely anti-colonial. I mean, this was this is where he started. That's where he became a writer, because he couldn't wanted to respond to the colonial violence he saw in his time in Burma, as was, and was always silently protesting. So Orwell still is very important to me.
It's interesting, that particular Orwell is one that a lot of people come to when they're quite young, I think. I read it when I was like 19, and it's not one I've gone back to. Have you ever gone back to it?
Yes, and that's what's really interesting. You go back to text and discover new things. So like in the second chapter is the most appalling description of child rape. And I can't remember reading this.
No, I don't remember that.
No. And Victor Gollancz, who was Orwell's first publisher, this is his first book, published in 1933, said to Eric, his real name is Eric Blair, we really can't have this. This is just so gruesome. This is really, it's a description of a young child prostitute being raped. And Orwell said two things which are very Orwell. One is, this is the best bit of writing in the whole book. I'm not giving it up. Two, this is what happens. I'm not editing it out. And so he refused. And it is really, Orwell, I don't like Orwell writing about his sex. He's never good. But I do like where he's coming from in that sense. But of course, when I read it first time round, perhaps we just read so many descriptions of sexual violence, they just flew over our head. But I don't remember it. I did.
Yeah, I don't remember that either, but I think you're right. And I think also when you're reading from the perspective of being a young woman, it's so proximate to you anyway, in your experience. It's so kind of around you in the world. You can't really take it all in every time, I don't think. But also it strikes me that phrase, but this is what happened. That's quite an Arendtian perspective, isn't it? Like we recognize reality so that we can resist it.
Arendt adored Orwell and taught his work a lot. And they never met. But if you look at the notes for 1984, for Orwell's 1984, they could almost be the notes for her first famous book, Origins of Totalitarianism. So both of them saying, well, what happens when politics gets in your mind? What happens when politics stops you from taking responsibility?
And for thinking for yourself.
And for thinking for yourself, yeah.
So is there a book that has either inspired or changed the way you think about the work that you do, or the work that you have done?
It was actually Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is Arendt's account of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi war criminal, one of the key Nazis responsible for the Holocaust, who escaped to Argentina, and then Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, caught him, brought him back to Jerusalem. And I'd read the book before, but I reread it during the Gulf War and after 9/11 and the War of Terror. And up to that point, I'd been really interested in psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is very good at asking the question, where does evil come from? How does evil traumatize us? And so trauma theory and that kind of sense of a world broken, a world in despair, of a trauma that needed to be spoken was very, very current. And as you remember from that time, what was shocking about the Gulf War was not only 9/11, which was shocking enough in itself, but was for our generation, I think, the return of wide-scale political violence. You'll remember, won't you, the return of torture. We had headlines, op-eds that said, "Is this the time for torture?" We had the return in this country, in the US, of the political lie, so weapons of mass destruction. I think that the beginning of our current mistrust, certainly in this country, with politicians, came from that moment. And it was all very distressing, and I thought, actually, the psychoanalysis isn't answering the questions I have. So I reread Eichmann in Jerusalem, and what struck me first of all, she says that I went as a reporter, so it's a good piece of journalism, apart from the bits she gets wrong, and she gets some very serious bits wrong. But it was her sense of trying to work out what was happening. And part of the things she was looking for, I mean, she'd been interested in Eichmann for years. There's only 7 months between these two. They come from the same generation. They came from quite similar middle-class families and took very different routes. And when Arendt Arendt was one of the first people to find out about the death camps in the Jewish community in New York. And you look at her earlier work and you look at her notes, she was trying to find out stuff. I mean, she was pretty obsessed with getting this stuff down. When she got to the Nuremberg trials, she didn't go to the Nuremberg trials, and she said to Karl Jaspers, her tutor, she said, how can we put these guys on trial? Because what they've done is so radically, obscenely extreme. They've broken the rules. They've broken the rules of morality. They've broken the law. They've exploded the limits of law. I'm worried, she said, that we won't be able to address their crime. And Karl Jaspers said, be careful, don't give them the kind of demonic press that they want. Don't play into their mythology. And then Jaspers, not Arendt, says, you have to look at these things in their banality. This is 46. Several years later, she says, right, when Eichmann was caught, she says, I've got to go and look at this living disaster face to face. I've got to go and look at this evil face to face. And she gets there, and she says she was really worried that the trial was exactly wanting to find a kind of what she thought was a caricature of evil, rather than grappling with the thing that she saw, which was, how has this got into our world? She described Eichmann as a new type of criminal, and the crime he committed was not just against Jewish people, although it was, but it was a crime against humanity itself. And what she meant by that was that humanity is made up of plurality. So if you commit genocide, you're not only decimating a people, you're decimating plurality, which is the condition of the world. So you're damaging humanity. So she said, how can we actually think about charging this new kind of crime? And the genocide that she was talking about, the Holocaust, was an industrial scale genocide. It was a murder that allowed people to walk back. I mean, Eichmann would always say, I hate violence. And this is why she talked about banality. There's this blithering, pathetic idiot, he's not an idiot, actually, this horrible man in the dock saying, I hate violence, can't bear the sight of blood. This is the man who, personally made sure that 6 million Jewish people went to their deaths. He says, the worst thing, only thing I regret, he says at one point, and Arendt really hated this, was I lost my temper in Vienna and slapped a Jewish leader in the face. I should not have done that. And she said, the worst things were happening to Jewish people in 1943 when you were losing your temper. So she wanted to understand the new nature of that evil because she thought it had got into the world and was not going anywhere.
She didn't see it as something that had roots in history, in what already existed. She saw it as a kind of new form of evil.
Well, it did have roots, but she didn't want to give one cause. So, you had lots of people at the time saying, well, it's the Germans. Or you had the prosecution in Israel, or the brilliant prosecution, saying this is the latest chapter of anti-Semitism, which of course it was. But her question was, well, yes, but it's different. And she also didn't want to concede to the idea that either anti-Semitism or German evil were things that were in the world forever and ever. But in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, she originally called it The Elements of Shame. And it's in 3 sections. So this first section is anti-Semitism, which is a history of modern anti-Semitism. The middle section was imperialism. Because she said race thinking and imperialism created the conditions for totalitarianism. What happened, and she wasn't the only one to make this, Aimé Césaire made the point earlier, Fanon did later. What happened is colonial and imperial practices boomeranged back to Europe, and Europeans started treating themselves in the same way they treated people in the colonies. So concentration camps, mass murder, etc. I mean, they were different quantitatively and qualitatively, but that's where it came from. And the last section was called Totalitarianism. So her book was originally called, she called it things like anti-Semitism, imperialism, and racism. And her American publisher was going, I'm not sure if that's going to play in America. Because America in the 1950s was very racist. There were anti-Semitic quotas in the university. It was still very anti-Semitic. So he didn't think the book would sell if you kind of said, well, this is the problem, racism and anti-Semitism. Why not call it totalitarianism and put the other things in small print, which is a much better title. And she wanted to call it originally The Burden of Our Times or The Elements of Shame.
Wow. Yes, it is a better title. Totalitarianism. I mean, the banality of evil is this phrase that she is associated with, and it's been plucked from her thinking and kind of used in all sorts of different ways, I think, particularly in the last 20 years. But it's such an evocative phrase. It's such an evocative statement. And I wonder whether you think it... I don't quite know how to phrase this. I think basically there's something about the use of the word banal and banality in there, in conjunction with the word evil, that resists our temptation to place evil as something that happens over there, separate from us. And actually, when you bring the concept of banality into it, the Eichmann example is one specific, example, but actually when you think about how we can apply it more broadly to our contemporary political structures, and also actually to how we show up or fail to show up as citizens of the world, of our nations, whatever, whether there's something useful there because it means that essentially it doesn't allow us to completely absolve ourselves of responsibility, right?
It's really interesting. I was talking about this at the weekend in Brussels, and people were discussing the banality of evil and they wanted to apply it to themselves, like I do thoughtless things. And I kept on saying, well, it's not you, it's not the people who think that we're worried about, it's the people who don't think we're worried about, not the people who worry about what they do in the world. I think when she was talking about two things, one was structural and historical. The way we operate, the way we're evil is historical, right? So you develop technologies that enable you to do evil without having to look at someone in the face. So administrative evil, the structure of evil, is one really important thing. And I think in the case of Eichmann, I tend to think, and so do others, that she got the right thesis, but she got the wrong guy, because he was actually a real ideologue and really he knew what he was doing. He was a filthy little liar. But in terms of her thesis, which is like, what happens when you are distanced from the damage you do? Then she's on to something. And people have written about that. Even things when you think you're doing well, what are you doing? The second was existential, which is what kind of mind can do this kind of evil. I think a lot of people would have seen Zone of Interest, the film, which I felt the film that came out last year, which showed the commander of the Auschwitz living next door to Auschwitz, and people saying, what would I do? I thought that was a really kind of spurious, because of course you'd say, no, I wouldn't. But it's a slightly more difficult question when you're doing everyday things. And she remarked, first thing she noticed about Eichmann was the way he couldn't really talk. He spoke in cliches, some of which he made up himself and then kept on repeating, some of which were just self-important. And he was just like that, the guy who sat next to you in a wedding, and they're talking at you and through you, and you really wish they hadn't been sat next to you, and they keep on talking about themselves, and they really think they're important and clever. But they're not stupid, but they are unaware. There's something that isn't happening in their head that's connecting them to other people. And she said, this is the problem with Eichmann, is he never had a conversation in his head. He never heard his own voice. And because he couldn't hear that voice, other people, Jewish people in particular, did not exist for him. And he didn't have, she often says, and a passage I love, she writes slightly later, she loves Shakespeare's soliloquies, because what you have in Shakespeare's soliloquies is someone thinking to themselves and sharing it with you. And she says, look at Richard III, who's really evil, right? But Richard spends an awful lot of time talking to himself about whether to be evil or not. Yeah. Am I a villain? And then goes on and, okay, I am. But it takes forever, and it's fascinating, because you've got this guy who's talking to himself about what he's doing. Eichmann was not capable of soliloquizing to himself. He could not have that conversation. There was no one home. Not because he was stupid, but he was radically thoughtless. And she thought there were structures of modernity that allow that kind of thoughtlessness to happen. And one of the reasons she was worried about the law and politics, she said we hadn't recognized the extent to which that had happened. I mean, she didn't just write about Nazi Germany, she also wrote about the Stalin Soviet Union.
Radical thoughtlessness is something I think we could apply to many contemporary political leaders, actually. And again, it's too easy to dismiss them as stupid, isn't it? It's worse than that, because, to fully understand that some people in positions of extreme power lack the ability to reflect is very frightening, actually, because there seems like there's almost an element of choice in there, if they're not stupid, if they're not limited, basically, fundamentally.
Yeah. No, she always was very wary about the policy guys. Forgive me if there are lots of really brilliant policy people, but what happens? I mean, her other example, it's a very minor example in the scheme of things, was the Pentagon Papers, where revealing that the strategists had strategized basically to keep an image of America going rather than actual war strategy. So it's that kind of, so she says, in the Pentagon Papers you see people saying that the domino effect was just a silly theory. No one thought the domino effect was real, that one country would go communist than another. That's not what it was about.
Right, so it's a kind of closed loop. It's a rhetorical thing, basically.
Yeah. I mean, she was always very suspicious of philosophy or theory that did not encounter experience.
The next question, I feel like, I know you have an answer to it, but I feel like it's might be quite a hard one to answer, because it's about, if you were to recommend one book within your discipline for someone who was quite new to the subject, what would you recommend? But the thing is, your discipline stretches quite far in quite a lot of different directions. So, are we going to be thinking about a work of literature? Are we going to be thinking about a work of history? Are we going to be thinking about a work of theory? It could be anything.
Yeah, sorry about that. I do think, I start from literature, and I also do political theory and history. But I do think words, creative, imaginative words, have a power to do all those things and get into the places that strict disciplines cannot. So I chose for that Virginia Woolf's 3 Guineas, her big anti-war essay, which she published in 1938. And I reread it, actually, bits of it this morning, because I was thinking, why did I choose that? And it's a book it took her 7 years to write. And she wanted to write a sequel to her famous feminist tract. And what the story I like and I identify is she kept on gathering material about fascism, war, pacifism, and she couldn't put it together, so she put some of it in a novel and some of it in 3 Guineas. And if you published it today, you would be in trouble. I mean, she basically says fascism is deeply linked to misogyny. I'm not going to oppose war and fascism unless you tackle the structures of misogyny. That's her argument. And she also subtitled it On Being Despised, because she knew the blowback that she'd get in 1938 from taking that position. She was inspired to write it. When she finally pulled it together, she wrote it very quickly, but it was in 1935 when a Labour Party conference voted against a motion against rearming. And she saw what was going to happen at that point. So it's a mixture of literature, polemic, artistry, and sheer fury. And reading it again today, I mean, it's the thing, I keep on saying this, and I'm not the only one. The thing that unites contemporary populism and authoritarianism, from Iran, Afghanistan, to the US, to Hungary, is a misogyny that's so loud no one ever talks about it. Women are in the front line of this new totalitarian turn, everywhere. So reading Woolf today, I just thought, you know what, she was right.
I sometimes think, misogyny is the oldest hatred. It goes right the way back.
I don't know about that. I think, she also says, if you look at ideological thinking, people always pick things that shouldn't be in politics to begin with. So race, that was the Nazis. The whole thing was based on the fiction of race theory, coming from colonialism. Or Stalin, it was class. And so they always pick these big things that actually you couldn't hope to have a decent politics around, because politics is about plurality and working out hard compromises. That's what politics is. It's not about what people do with their bodies. I mean, she always, she said, any race laws that stop people marrying or sleeping together are the beginning of all totalitarian thinking. Once she said, because without love, you can't have new beginnings. Get out. So I think that's why. So I think I think misogyny is very old, anti-Semitism is very old, racism is very old, but they're all very useful for a kind of politics that doesn't want to do the work of politics and wants a quick fix and a quick way to get power.
Right, and I suppose it's a very clean way of dividing a population into for and against. Yeah. Do you feel like we're in an atmosphere of greater misogyny now than we were when you were younger, when you were doing your PhD, for example?
Well, not really, because it's always been there. It's always been awful. I think it's pressed up against our faces more. I mean, you could just ignore it. I can't believe this Greg Wallace, this TV show. That's on the front page of The Guardian. I mean, excuse me, obnoxious middle-aged men are not news. They're really not news. And they shouldn't be news. So I think it's about a kind of journalist cycle that has got used to that, and also social media. And in some ways, of course, things have got better in terms of rights, freedoms, and things you can do. But I think it is, it's the way that it produces a certain Friesen genre, and it plays to psychosocial fears.
Yes, and I suppose we're in the age of the 24-hour news cycle plus social media, which means we're in the age of the outrage cycle, and that's kind of what it's feeding.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and actually it feels like it's feeding the outrage without doing much to help us change it.
Yeah.
It's just kind of blowing angry air.
Yeah.
You write a lot about the current challenges facing humanity, a small subject, and you draw on Hannah Arendt's work to make sense of everything. So I wonder if there are any other books that you'd recommend that you would see as being important for people to read in order to better understand these issues.
Yeah, I think that follows from the last point. If you want passion that isn't just outrage, but is generous, you go to James Baldwin. And I say this, so the book I had chosen was The Fire Next Time, which is actually a book of 2 essays written in the 60s. And I'll tell you this. In the New Yorker, between 62 and 63, published Baldwin's A Region of My Mind, which is part of the essay that ended up in The Fire Next Time. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is my other book, and Hannah Arendt's Psychman in Jerusalem. So you had Baldwin, Rachel Carson, who I'll speak about in a minute, and James Baldwin within 6 months telling us what the problem with the modern world was. I came quite late to James Baldwin. I was after my 30s. Again, he wasn't really taught. And I came through the novels, and I first read, Go Tell It on the Mountain. I have to admit, I'm supposed to be a literary critic, but he's one of those writers, and there are 2 others. When you read them, you think, I don't know where this came from. There is I think he's God. But I also think Tolstoy and George Eliot are like that. There's a quality of writing that is just, shakes you to the bone. And people say, well, as he says in The Far Next Time, he grew up as a pastor, but his first awakening was into being a pastor. And he understands biblical language, but it's more than that. But in Far Next Time, Baldwin talks about love. And he talks about something called the constant, which goes back to this thing about reality. And he said that critical, free people have to pay attention to the constants. The constants are love and change. Pay attention, work through these. So, he was publishing a letter to my nephew and A Region of My Mind towards a white audience. This is the civil rights movement. He wanted to educate the white audience about black life in America, and with his unique voice. But he was also doing something very similar to Arendt, which is to say, look at what is here. What is here is love, and what is here is also change. This will change. And one of the things that he says beautifully is one of the things that white America needs to do is, one, stop projecting its badness into black people and think, stop projecting its frustrations, its prisoners. Learn to be a bit more black, he says. Learn to love, he says.
Also, the thing about having change at the heart of that philosophy is it's hugely optimistic as well. It's very generous because it says, you can have seen things the wrong way, or you can have seen things in the way that I'm telling you is not good, it's not helpful, but you can change. You can come over to my perspective, you can come over to my point of view, and it's worth it, it's nice here, it's good here, right? Whereas I think so much of the contemporary sort of dogmatic language that gets used in political discourse, it's very absolutist. It wants people to be, you are this, and this is a fixed thing. And I understand the temptation to do that when you're feeling so frustrated. Like, for example, to point at someone like Greg Wallace and say, you are a misogynist, is very tempting. But also, if you use that language in a closed circuit kind of way, it doesn't leave room for any progressive change, right?
Yeah.
Which I think Baldwin, one of the things about his voice that's so special is that he has this clarity and this fire in his voice, but there's also something very magnanimous there.
Yeah, well, there's something incredibly generous there. Yeah, certainly.
And what about the Rachel Carson.
Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the third essay that was published. Rachel Carson was a chemist, biologist, and also a writer. And this book is sort of like the first really book of environmentalism. It's a stunning book. She'd been, it does connect to Eichmann in Jerusalem. She'd been concerned that DDT, the chemical that was used as a pesticide, which had been developed in the war as part of, warfare, was now poisoning the earth. And she wrote this book against great opposition, demonstrating the damage the pesticides were doing. She's also a stunning writer, though. So what she does is show how biological life, natural life, animal life, and human life are connected. I wasn't very good at science at school. I thought it was very boring. When I read this book, if you're a non-scientist, it's just beautiful because it's a story about interrelatedness and interconnection. And as she's making the case against pesticides, she's actually, the same as Baldwin, same as Arendt, making a case for the world and through the diversity and the plurality of the natural world, which is also responsible and connected to our plurality and diversity. It's a beautiful book. And the other thing that always chokes me up, she died young. And as she was writing this book and then dealing with the fallout, JFK did a special commission based on her book. She was dying of breast cancer, so she was battling with chemo and feeling ill. And she would write about, well, this is biological life. Mind's going into a different phase now, as she was defending the diversity of the world. And I think it's just one of those first texts. And if you put it with Baldwin and Arendt, you have race, the environment, the banality of evil coming together as the things we need to pay real attention to. And they were really right.
Yeah, they really were. And they remain absolutely right. What are you reading right now? Are you reading anything that you would recommend?
Oh, great question.
I mean, you may be reading something you wouldn't recommend.
Oh, yeah. I realized I often have different books in different rooms. Not like I live in a big house, actually. I have a one-bedroom flat. In my mansion, I keep my...
I love that. What do you read in the ballroom?
Yes, in the ballroom. So I have different books on the go. I'm reading a book about aging called What We Have Become, which is in French at the moment. It's not translated yet, which is very beautiful because I'm working on age. I read most recently Emmanuel Carré's V13, which is his V13, which is his another piece of amazing reportage of a crime against humanity trial. So this is after the Paris attacks in 23. What remained of the outfit responsible, most of the actual attackers in the Paris attacks had been killed, were put on trial. And Emmanuel Carré writes this book with both survivors and interviewing perpetrators and people who became his friends. And again, I mean, this goes back, to all my writers, I think. He has this quality of attention. That's his moral response to something that is so horrific. He pays attention. And he's a very good writer. So in some ways, he's very like Orwell. He's just watching all the time. And it's a beautifully human book. It was translated very well and published this November, last month.
Yeah, he's another writer who has a real clarity of speech. He writes in... he writes about complex ideas in language that's completely accessible. He's a proper journalist in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and that's the other thing maybe that does unite my writers is they can move between journalism and fiction and theory because the task is always about communicating and joint understanding.
What one book do you feel, this is, I have to preface this by saying this is a massive, massive question that I think is impossible for anyone to answer, but what one book do you feel everyone must read in their lifetime?
I actually did put down Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, but it's sneaky for me to do that because he smuggles in a lot of other books. If This Is a Man, Primo Levi was a Jewish chemist who was arrested in January 44 and taken to Auschwitz. And he survived because he was young and he was skilled and he was very lucky. He was released in January 45, started work on If This Is a Man a year later and wrote it very quickly. He's like Rachel Carson, he's a scientist, so he casts this kind of forensic eye on what is happening in the camp. And I do think everyone should read it. It's just brilliant and beautiful, but he also conjures up a history that we're both indebted to and the history that we've failed. So the scene I always return back to is in a chapter called The Canto of Ulysses. So the reference there is to Homer, and the reference there is to Dante. And he's describing how one of the jobs that people wanted in the camp was the soup cat, to go and get the soup, with this young guy called the Piccolo, who was the young guy who went to get the soup. Not that the soup was anything worth eating, because you could talk. And he describes walking across the camp with Jean, the Piccolo, trying urgently from nowhere to describe Dante's Inferno to Jean, who's French. Levi didn't have French, so he's doing it in Italian. He's doing it in Italian. But he says somehow he understood. This amazing book about hell. In hell, they were understood that they were trying to affirm each other's humanity just by trying to have the conversation. And later, Levi says, let me be very clear, I'm not saying that poetry and art can redeem this. It can't, ever. But what it can do is, the fact that you couldn't translate Dante in Auschwitz. Of course you couldn't translate Dante in Auschwitz because it was everything that we should not be. So that book, I think, everyone now should certainly read.
Right, exactly. Another book for now, unnervingly. Let's talk about your book. So your book, We Are Free to Change the World, which is about Hannah Arendt, is out now, about her thinking. And the subtitle is Lessons in Love and Disobedience, which I really enjoyed, especially because I think for those of us who know of Arendt and know of her in the context of the banality of evil, and maybe know of her in the context of some of those aphorisms that we might have seen on Instagram or on Twitter or whatever, we might have heard people repeat, I don't think we would necessarily think of her as someone who was writing about love or thinking about love. So why did you want to foreground that in your subtitle?
Yeah, I didn't to start with. I got the contract for the book after Trump, and then COVID happened. And so I thought I was going to go around the world retracing Arendt's footsteps and have a great time. And I wrote it in my one-bedroom flat. And I hadn't realized where her fierceness really came from. And her fierceness comes from her capacity to love the world. And I didn't know that before. I didn't know. There's two things. One is her emphasis on vulnerability. So she talks a lot about human frailty. And she says that's the price we pay to be human together. And that's, what if you began politics with a recognition of frailty, not with trying to deny it? What if you begin with the sense of this terribly beautiful, infinitely precious, terribly frail world and work backwards? That's where she started. She wrote about love for her PhD thesis, but then she returned and rewrote. And she had enormous capacity for love. She was a really good friend. She was a very serious lover. She wrote poetry. There's a new translation of her poetry is just published. It's very, very interesting. But her basic thing about love is two things. One is love testifies to plurality in a weird way. When we love, we always think we're unique. This is the annoying thing about people who've just fallen in love. They're terribly boring. Because they're fascinated, or when you with your baby with that kind of love. No two have loved if we have. And it's like if you fall in love, you don't want to tell anyone because it'll be spoiled once you do that. And she said, but the paradox, the ironic thing is that's what makes us all alike. This capacity for love is actually about difference as well. So she says that love is the precondition of politics. The other really important thing about love is how we start again. This is her reading of Augustine. So instead of everything being about going towards death. There's no meaning, God is dead, etc., etc. She was a modernist. Instead of saying, well, it's death and groundlessness, and you just have to pull yourself together, a la Heidegger or Jean-Paul Sartre, and overcome this existential void. She says, not death, it's love. Because what existence teaches us is, well, first of all, we know we're going to die, but the other thing we know is we came from nowhere. We all share this. It's a mystery. And we came from nowhere because at some point somebody loved.
Yeah, it's very powerful. I'm still kind of stuck on the idea that what if we grew politics out of our shared frailty? Because I don't think capitalism would exist if we began with our shared frailty. I think there are so many political systems that would never have come to be because so much of them seem to be about denying that, or at least how they've been warped in contemporary culture. I think about, you said you're writing now about age, and I think that certainly in America and in the UK, we're more and more in a moment that wants to deny frailty, the frailty that comes with aging, wants to silo it and make it something that happens off stage rather than welcoming it into the center of our culture and recognizing that, if we live long enough, if we're lucky to have a long life, we will all end up frail, and that frailty will be, again, what unites us.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things there. One is, the other cultures do have a different relationship to aging, wisdom, and death. Our current age positivity would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. Which everyone's saying, it's fine, look, you can have bright grey hair and be really fit, and you can be old in a way that doesn't really mean you're old. And you think, no, being old is horrible. Things don't work. You can't do the things you did. You know you're going to die. It's not being at the gym. But there's something about that which touches reality. And I think in terms of the climate catastrophe, this is ours is the first generation who will die not knowing whether the earth will survive. And whereas usually in death you think, well, I've left something. I love the world enough to care about its future. There's something there. We've skewered that relationship, hopefully not fatally. Arendt was going to write a book on old age, on endings, but she smoked so much. She died at 67, and so she never really got to be old. And 67 is very young in my book.
67 is very young in every book, I think. It should be anyway. That's very interesting that she was going to write about age. Yeah. Do you feel her in your... I mean, we're not going to talk too much about your new work, but do you feel her voice in it?
Yeah. She wanted to quarrel with Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote a big book on being old, and she didn't agree with Beauvoir. So I do think, I wonder what kind of old would she have been? In some ways, she got old about 50. She just sort of wore it well. Yeah.
That's a conversation I'd really like to listen in on, to Beauvoir and Arendt. Yeah. Maybe throw Simone Weil in there as well and see.
Yeah. Who also died tragically young.
She did, yeah. And in Kent, which is always a surprising fact. Yeah. We have a last question, and then we've got some time for questions from the audience, and there are roving mics, so have a think about anything you would like to ask. But before we get there, the last question is, are there any books that you would recommend that speak about a similar topic, or books that inspired you to write We Are Free to Change the World?
Yeah, We Are Free to Change the World is not an academic book. I spent half of it going, my colleagues are going to hate me. I can keep my head down. But I was very inspired by two books. One by Eddie Glaude on James Baldwin called Begin Again, Baldwin's America and Why We Need Him Now. And Eddie does something very similar to what I was trying to do, which is to have a conversation with someone, a major figure from the 20th century, from the position today. And it's a great book. The other one is Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses. Rebecca Solnit really has a deep relationship to Orwell as an activist, as a writer, and the way that she tells his story to bring out this Orwell who, like all the writers I've spoken about tonight, cared deeply for the world and wasn't prepared to let it go. So those two books, I think, are wonderful models of having a conversation with the 20th century from now.
That deep openness and sensitivity to the world is really critical, actually, for writers. And I think, you know, you work across disciplines, you have an academic background, you're still very much in academia at the moment, but you're moving also into, as you say, trade books and journalism and all of this, which you've obviously always done. But I think that there's something about academic rigor that demands that we check our raw sensitivity at the door in a way that is actually very counterproductive to knowledge.
Yeah.
And counterproductive to everything that you've been describing Arendt, for example, and Baldwin and Orwell being interested in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is going to sound terrible. This is something we're very interested in the academy.
You ruin everything, you guys.
Precisely about what happens when you put conversations that are asked by the humanities and the arts into public discourse. But at the same time, especially in a post-truth disinformation culture, you actually need, you need us. You need the nerd who turns around and says, no, it wasn't 1938, it was actually 3 years ago. Or you didn't read that as stats. Or there's another archive you need to check. We can show you, we should be doing this in our teaching, we're not nearly doing it enough. We can show you how to check whether this is true or not. And we can teach you how to create a case that will show that truth. And we can also teach you how to debate those truths.
Yeah, and I think what's difficult is you have the kind of objective eye of the academy, and then you have the highly personal eye of social media and of, you know, the personal pronouncement, which we're all encouraged to make constantly. And I think what's very interesting about your book, We're Free to Change the World, and the books you've mentioned, you know, like the Solnet, it's basically scholars working in a way that is bringing everything that they're, and your kind of academic training and all the knowledge you've amassed through that into a space where your personal eye is also welcome, and you also invite the personal perspective of your reader, which is not something that academia does very well.
No.
So I think it's very exciting writing, basically, to be straddling all of those different things. But I wonder if you feel like you're what's the idiom? There's an idiom about having two masters or something like that. You know what I mean? Like,
well, this is also the great thing about age, is that I don't care.
Excellent.
And I don't have to care, because actually my academic life was very privileged compared to the one that we have today. I do think we're at a time of crisis, and people who can speak need to speak and speak clearly and speak well. And if you're in a good enough position that you are able to do that, you need to be doing it. But I also go back to, I'm sure everyone in this room, you know, that young person with a book in your room, trying to work out the world and finding friends in different voices, or finding, you know, that people had a sense of the world that wasn't exactly the same as yours, but was really in that world, really loved that world, is liberating. It's a real, you know, I believe in the humanizing power of literature, but I also believe that it has the power for revolution and freedom.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave things. Do we have any questions from the audience? If so, stick your hand up and a microphone will come to you.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't think the mic is on, actually. Can someone from tech help? Thank you. Would you like to take mine? Why don't you just have this one?
Thank you. Oh yeah, perfect. Thank you, that was really interesting. Your recommendations were really, sorry, it's weird to hear my voice. Your recommendations were really great, but I think they were mainly non-fiction or essays or reportage. So I just wondered if you had any fiction recommendations. I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I mean, my fiction list. Where do you start and where do you end? I mean, part of, going back to my mum, her gift to me was to give me the best 20th century writers there are, which are always worth rereading. So I read loads of Iris Murdoch, I read it as a young person, Graham Greene, etc., etc. this sounds sort of hopelessly old-fashioned, but when I've had my first academic job, I taught at Kingston Poly, and I was writing my PhD, and I thought I'd got a really great job because all I had to teach was poetry, and poetry is great to teach because you can do it the night before. You know, you can prepare a few poems, and then the joy of close reading. And they phoned me up the week before and said, we've had to change the schedule, and we're now teaching the 19th century European novel. And I had this crash course in the 19th century European novel. I was literally we used to do a book a week. Week 1, Middlemarch, Madame Bovary, Crime and Punishment, War and Peace. What I really loved about them, I learned to love the 19th century novel with a real passion, is I did see the predicaments of our time in those novels, which were about agency, freedom compromised, but also that sheer work of bringing a new world, and the 19th century was a new world, into life. So anything from the 19th century, even though I'm a 20th century scholar, I will go back to. Yeah. I'm trying to think of the books I reread. I reread George Eliot quite regularly.
Thank you. And we've got one just in the front here.
I was going to ask a very similar question, so I'll just build on it. But are there any fiction books that you would recommend or that are particularly profound to you around totalitarianism? Like, what do you think is the best fiction book that deals with that? That's a big question, sorry.
The most recent best book is Anna Burns's The Milkman, which is I think it's a work of genius. It's an account of Belfast during the Troubles, with a female character whose compulsive habit is to read in public. So she walks around, as I suspect lots of people in this room used to do, book reading. And it struck me because it was published not long after Masha Gessen's book on post-Glasnost Russia, The Future is History, how totalitarianism reclaimed history. Masha Gessen was criticized for using the word totalitarian. Anna Burns uses the word totalitarianism at least 4 times in that novel to talk about a wartime or civil war surveillance culture that impacts on women, reading and imagination in particular. She was also criticized for using that word. So I think, if I had in my dreams, I would teach Origins of Totalitarianism alongside Anna Burns, The Milkman.
I would sign up for that course. Do we have any other questions? Oh, great.
You started off by talking about Hannah Arendt and her views of the banality of evil. I must say I violently disagree, but...
So would you mind putting the microphone closer to your mouth? Thank you.
I violently disagree about the description of evil that she, and the epithet that she used, because it begs a lot of questions about agency. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, to an extent I agree with you. I think, as I said, she got the right thesis and the wrong man with Eichmann. Eichmann was a Nazi anti-Semite who knew what he was doing and wanted to do it. I think her question about what happens to agency in different contexts, not him, is the absolute right one. But I do think in that particular case, not so much. I think there's also a temptation when you hear the banality of evil, that somehow the banality cancels out the evil. So it almost sounds like she's saying it's banal, which is horrific. And what she's actually saying is it's the evil that has become banal that you need to watch for. I love Eichmann in Jerusalem as a book, and I battle with it every time I read it. What I find more difficult than the banality of evil thesis is her attack on the Jewish council leaders for complicity, and including people like Leo Back and people like that. And I think she was demonstrably wrong on a couple of occasions when she made that accusation. And her tone was wrong. And that bothers me more than the banality of evil.
Thank you. Another question here. Thank you.
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I had a question, and I apologize in advance if it's not very well formulated, because I only thought about that question while I was listening to you, so it's not rehearsed. Something that I'm struggling with today is how terms that I used to associate with being on the good side, such as resistance, are now being appropriated by terrorist groups, for example, who justify attacks. I'm thinking about October 7th, under the false pretense that is justified resistance. And I'm very, very troubled by large swathe of population who probably start with their heart in the right place, students, academics, and others, who I think gets lured by the vocabulary of resistance or the utilization of slogans like colonialism, which should not be used as slogans, but they are sort of placated on a reality, to justify a kind of sort of self-righteousness. So what I worry about is the lack of tools that I see people seem to have that makes them think that they are on the right side, but they're actually buying wholesale some arguments that are utilizing these very profound concepts as labels. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but I'm wondering if you thought about that.
I do understand what you're saying. As you were talking, I was again thinking of Arendt towards the end of her life in her essay on violence. And she said, I worry that political violence has now become so normalized we won't be able to find another way of doing politics. So there's an assumption that violence and politics go together. And we've got to disentangle that assumption if we've got a future, she thought. So I share that. And I think there is something that, again, we can go back to social media here about, there's a kind of quickness of language and unthinkingness, Arendt would call it, that isn't getting anywhere near the reality or the horror or culpability or questions of responsibility, because it becomes, you have absolute angels and absolute villains. And, this isn't helpful. And I also agree, with the language of resistance. I often think actually maybe I won't say this, but resistance is still going on. It's going on all the time. And I look at the women in Iran who publicly risk their lives by doing something very Arendtian, which is being in public, being seen to act. I think they're some of the most courageous political actors that we have, and we could learn a lot from them. Yeah, but I share your sense, and I think it's going back to again what we do in the work of the British Academy, but it's why we need to protect the humanities as spaces for thinking and debate and asking ourselves what language mean, what does resistance mean, what does violence mean, what does it mean to say this is a great act of anti-colonial resistance. Let's take those words apart. Let's hear, Arendt might say, how those echo in our heads.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are pretty much out of time.
David, we had one question online, if that's okay.
We have one
online question.
Oh, fantastic.
Which is from Li Wang, and she's asked, what topics in your area of research need to be researched but have not yet been?
Old women.
And that, my friends, is a trailer for what is coming. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Let's have a massive round of applause for Professor Lyndsey Stonebridge. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your brilliant questions. Thank you for being a fantastic audience. And thank you to the British Academy for all of the amazing work that you do and for having me tonight to host. It's been great.